Thank you for joining us today for another presentation of Let the Bible Speak with your speaker, Brett Hickey.
Thank you for watching Let the Bible Speak. Let the Bible Speak is different than most religious programming. We never ask for money, and we distribute free sermons and free Bible study materials. We have no personal jets, and we do not sit in ivory towers. Even though we have never met, we care deeply about you and value being in touch with you personally. We've spoken with some of you by phone or in person and look forward to getting better acquainted with others. We hope you will contact us and let us help you with your spiritual needs. We continue in the book of Genesis, where Joseph repeatedly overcomes misfortune through patient continuance in doing right. Everyone loves an underdog, and few individuals rival this comeback. Joseph holds firm to his religious convictions in a strange land, surrounded by people worshiping foreign gods. Joseph refuses to hold a grudge against those who malign and mistreat him, as well as those who fail to reward him for his great kindnesses. Joseph endears us with his tender heart and his deep love for his father. Joseph and Jesus share striking similarities. As Jesus leaves the comfort of his home in heaven, so Joseph is falsely accused, bound, thrust from his home, stripped of his clothing, sold for the price of a slave, and taken to Egypt. Joseph begins his great work at age 30, saving multitudes from starvation, while Jesus, beginning at age 30, begins his ministry in which he will save multitudes from condemnation. God turns the cruelties Joseph and Jesus experience into tremendous blessings for the masses. Just as only the Father has greater authority than Jesus, no one but Pharaoh outranks Joseph. Both Jesus and Joseph are specially loved by their fathers. The brothers of Jesus and Joseph reject them out of jealousy. The brothers of Joseph and Jesus fail to recognize them as rulers. Joseph's brothers at long last recognize and fully respect him. The same will someday be true for Jesus. Some in this life, the rest on Judgment Day. One famous New Testament scripture about Jesus, especially within families that practice some form of memorization, is John 11:35. Why? Families who memorize know this verse because it is so brief. Jesus wept. Well, Joseph wept also. More about Joseph after our song.
Encamp along the hills of light, ye Christian soldiers rise, and press the battle ere the night shall veil the glowing skies. Against the foe in vales below, let all our strength be heard. Faith is the victory we know, that overcomes the world. Faith is the victory. Faith is the victory, oh, glorious victory that overcomes the world. To him that overcomes the foe, my payment shall be given. Before the angels he shall know his name confessed in heaven. Then onward from the hills of light, our hearts with love aflame will vanquish all the hosts of night. In Jesus' conquering name, faith is the victory. Faith is the victory, oh, glorious victory that overcomes the world.
The word wept is interesting. It is found only 69 times in the entire Bible. 9 of the 69 times that you find the word wept in the Bible are in the story of Joseph. Although the story has a strong positive ending, much of Joseph's story involves heartbreak. Joseph is born in Genesis 30, but we really don't begin to get acquainted with Joseph until Genesis 37 when he is 17. Then Joseph becomes the dominant character for the rest of Genesis. What makes Joseph's weeping so interesting, though, is that we read nothing of Joseph weeping when his brothers strip him of the coat of many colors given him by his father Jacob. We don't read of Joseph weeping when his brothers threw him in the pit, Genesis 37:23. No weeping, as far as we know, when they sold Joseph to Midianite traders for 20 pieces of silver, Genesis 37:28. No weeping in Genesis 39 when the wife of Potiphar, the captain of the Egyptian guard, had Joseph wrongly imprisoned for falsely accusing him of assaulting her. No weeping when the butler forgot to mention him to Pharaoh in return for interpreting his dream. If ever anyone had the right to complain, to whine, to grumble, to say, "Woe is me," as a victim of terrible injustice and mistreatment, it was Joseph. Yet Joseph, like Jesus, instead of choosing self-pity, bitterness, and revenge, demonstrated great courage, putting his trust in God, willing to leave it all in the hands of the Almighty. Joseph does not drown in self-pity when everything turns against him, but neither is he cold and heartless. Jesus weeps in John 11:35, not over Lazarus' death, since Jesus plans to raise Lazarus from the dead. Rather, Jesus weeps as he witnesses the anguish of those crushed by Lazarus' passing. We read in John 11, verse 33, "Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled." Understand, this was not a sign of weakness, but a sign of great strength and a loving, tender heart that could be touched by the pain of others. In Luke 19:41 through 45, Jesus weeps over the city of Jerusalem because they refused to heed his repeated warnings of the coming dangers. The apostle informs us of Jesus' agony in Gethsemane in Matthew 26, verse 36 through 38. Then Jesus began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. Then he said to them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death." Referencing the same hour, the writer tells us in Hebrews 5, verse 7, that Jesus, in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and was heard because of his godly fear. These insights do not make us think less of Jesus and Joseph. No, they increase our respect for them. You see, real men do cry. When the apostle called the Ephesian elders at Miletus, he told them in Acts 20, verse 18 and 19, "You know, from the first day that I came to Asia, in what manner I always lived among you, serving the Lord with all humility, with many tears and trials, which happened to me by the plotting of the Jews." The Apostle Paul was one of the toughest men to ever live. Read 2 Corinthians 11 and chapter 12. But he too shed tears. On the same occasion, after warning the elders of the dangers of false teachers, he implored them in verse 31, "Therefore watch and remember, for 3 years I did not cease to warn everyone night and day with tears." Don't be concerned if you have a tender heart like these great men. Be concerned if you are beyond feeling. Back to our story. We're now in Genesis chapter 41 as we review and think back on what happened so long ago. Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams and provides a solution to the great drought that's coming. Pharaoh rewards Joseph by making him ruler over the entire country. Genesis 41:24. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." Genesis 41, verse 56 says, "The famine was over all the face of the earth." People everywhere come to Egypt to buy food. As a result, Pharaoh's wealth and power explode. Canaan was not immune to the famine. The food supply for Jacob, his 11 sons, and their families is decimated as well, forcing Joseph's brothers, except Benjamin, to make the journey to Egypt for provisions. There's great tension at Joseph's reunion with his brothers. We read in Genesis chapter 42, verse 7. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he acted as a stranger to them and spoke roughly to them. When Joseph accused them of being spies, the brothers shared their family history. Joseph insists they bring their youngest brother to prove their honesty. He sends them home with grain. The brothers agonize over wronging Joseph, certain they are facing the consequences from God, unaware that Joseph understood them. Joseph's brothers deserve full retribution, and Joseph lowers the boom, but he has to work at it. Joseph is not jaded by his mistreatment and suffering, nor is he aloof or insensitive after his rise to a position of great power. He is touched by their humility and contrition. Oh, they've changed over the years. His tenderness leads him to weep in verse 24. And he turned himself away from them and wept. Then he returned to them again and talked with them. And he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. Simeon was likely chosen as the one to stay bound because he was the most bitter enemy of Joseph and the likely leader of the conspiracy against Joseph years earlier. Jacob's last words to Simeon and Levi in Genesis 49, verse 6 and 7, appear to justify that conclusion. On his deathbed, his own father speaks of his fierce anger and cruel wrath and also calls him an instrument of cruelty. Returning home, the brothers' hearts sank when they realized the money they had used to buy food had been placed back in their sacks. This, unbeknown to them, was Joseph's doing. How will they convince Egypt's prime minister of their honor? Jacob refused to let the other brothers take Benjamin back with them, as Joseph demanded be done, until the severity of the famine left him no choice. Upon their return, Joseph had his steward prepare a great meal. The brothers were on edge about going to the prime minister's house. They thought this meant they would become slaves. The steward reassured them, saying their God was responsible for sending the money back with them. After visiting with all the brethren and hearing all was well with Jacob, Joseph looked at Benjamin and was overcome with emotion. Genesis 43, verse 30 and 31 reads, Now his heart yearned for his brother, so Joseph made haste and sought somewhere to weep, and he went into his chamber and wept there. Then he washed his face and came out, and he restrained himself and said, Serve the bread. The brothers were dumbfounded when they were assigned seating in order from the oldest to the youngest. How could this be mere coincidence? Benjamin was given 5 times the food the others received, but they were still clueless. Joseph had his servants plant his silver cup in Benjamin's bag. On their way home, Joseph sent his steward after them to check their sacks for his cup. They protested their innocence, saying, If the cup was found on one of them, let him die, and let the rest of us be your slaves. Their worst nightmare is realized. Joseph's cup was found in Benjamin's bag. You can hear their collective guttural groans as they tear their clothes. They return to Joseph and fall down before him. Judah, serving as spokesman, tells Joseph in Genesis chapter 44, verse 16 and 17, What shall we say to my Lord? What shall we speak, or how shall we clear ourselves? God has found out the iniquity of your servants. Here we are, my Lord's slaves, both we and he also with whom the cup was found. But he said, Far be it from me that I should do so. The man in whose hand the cup was found, he shall be my slave. And as for you, go up in peace to your father. All these years, they've kept their dirty secret from Jacob. They rid the family of Joseph, but could not escape their guilt. And now that trouble hounds them at every turn, their guilt steadily escalates. Judah tells of their father Jacob losing Benjamin's older brother. Judah pleads with Joseph, If we come home without Benjamin, It will kill our father. Please let me stay in Benjamin's place. I can't bear to put my father to any more grief. Genesis chapter 45, beginning with verse 1, records Joseph's gut-wrenching reaction to Judah's confession. The Bible says, "Then Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, 'Make everyone go out from me.' So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, 'I am Joseph. Does my father still live?' Can you imagine? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. And Joseph said to his brothers, 'Please come near to me.' So they came near. Then he said, 'I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance.'" Listen to Joseph's spirit of faith, acceptance, and forgiveness. "So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt." Joseph sends them home to bring Jacob and all the family to Goshen so he can provide for them. What a gracious, God-centered response. Instead of unleashing a torrent of hate on his tormentors, Joseph puts all he endured in perspective. He keeps the big picture in mind. He never clears them of wrongdoing, but through it all, he remembers that God is still on the throne. 3 times in his speech on providence, Joseph says, "God sent me. God sent me before you to preserve life. God sent me to preserve a prosperity for you and to save your lives. And it was not you who sent me here, but God, and he has made me a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt." Clearly, Joseph gives us a great example of a man who walked by faith and not by sight. What an inspiration. Although rosier in the end than it is for most of God's children, the story of Joseph serves as a great illustration of the Apostle Paul's words in Romans 8:28. "And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose." Burton Kaufman insists that this promise is not universal, no, but is for members today of the Lord's church. After all, who else could be described as those who love God and those who are called according to his purpose? Jesus made it abundantly clear in John 14, verse 15, that those who loved Jesus were those who obeyed his commands. Obviously, those who refuse to obey the gospel of Jesus Christ, 2 Thessalonians 1, 7 through 9, are shut out from this blessing. J.W. McGarvey adds, "We know, partly by experience, but primarily by revelation, that all these present ills, hardships, adversities, afflictions, etc., are so overruled of God as to be made to combine to produce the permanent and eternal advantage and welfare of those who love God, or who may otherwise be described as those that are called according to his purpose." All things evidently refers to all that class of events which threaten to result in evil. The gospel reveals God's purpose to redeem, justify, and glorify those who believe in Jesus. Those who accept this gospel through belief in Jesus are truly called of God according to the purpose for which he extended the call. Paul does not regard unbelievers as thus called, as the context shows, for the other descriptive clause which he here applies to the called, those who love God, would not be applicable to unbelievers. Therefore, the two clauses taken together show that Paul is simply speaking of Christians, or those who have heard the gospel and have accepted it and have been saved by it. All such know assuredly that God will direct the events of life so that they shall result in good to those called according to his purpose. For his purpose is of such import, such magnitude, such eternal fixedness and perennial vitality, etc., McGarvey says, as to be a guarantee that God will permit no temporal accidents to thwart it. End quote. God used Joseph for his own purposes. Since the Lord so willed that Joseph accomplish certain tasks for his glory, no series of misdeeds from his brothers or anyone else could frustrate God's intentions. What about Christians today? Jesus came that we might have life and that we might have it more abundantly. But Christians are at times a bit naive about how God blesses his people. When Jesus said, "My yoke is easy, my burden is light," he clearly spoke of a yoke and a burden. Yes, light and easy, but a burden and a yoke nonetheless. The bottom line, both of Romans 8:28 and the story of Joseph, is that God will never leave us. Never leave his people. He will give us the strength to shoulder our load, and that ultimately there is a reward for remaining faithful to God that far outweighs our trials. The lyrics of this song by Annie Johnson Flitt eloquently convey this truth. God hath not promised skies always blue, flower-strewn pathways all our lives through. God hath not promised sun without rain, joy without sorrow, peace without pain. God hath not promised we shall not know toil and temptation, trouble and woe. He hath not told us we shall not bear many a burden, many a care. God hath not promised smooth roads and wide, swift, easy travel, needing no guide. Never a mountain rocky and steep, never a river turbid and deep. But God hath promised strength for the day, rest for the labor, light for the way, grace for the trials, help from above, unfailing sympathy, undying love. Friends, I hope you have been moved by this great story of perseverance, forgiveness, and faithfulness to God. Surely, Joseph was a type of Christ. Stay with us to learn how you can get a copy of this message after our song.
I serve a risen Savior, he's in the world today. I know that he is living, whatever it may say. I see his hand of mercy, I hear his voice of cheer. And just the time I need him, he's always near. He lives, Christ Jesus lives today. He walks with me and talks with me along life's narrow way. He lives, salvation to impart. You ask me how I know he lives. He lives within my heart. Rejoice, rejoice, O Christians, lift up your voice and sing. Eternal hallelujahs to Jesus Christ the King, the hope of all who seek him, the help of all who find. None other is so loving, so good and kind. He lives, Christ Jesus lives today. He walks with me and talks with me along life's narrow way. He lives,
Thank you for watching Let the Bible Speak. We pray that you have heard God speak to you through His Word. Contact us for a copy of Joseph Wept, number 1403. We offer a free Bible study by mail, and we can also help you. We can help answer your questions as you go through it. Visit letthebiblespeak.com to watch videos, hear audio, and read transcripts of the program. You can get the Let the Bible Speak app. Both the app and the website are searchable. You can search for subjects of particular interest. On behalf of the congregations listed shortly, we echo the sentiment of the Apostle Paul when he wrote in Romans 16, verse 16, "The churches of Christ salute you." Until next week, goodbye, and may God bless